Welcome back to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comet Magazine. I'm your host, Ann Snyder, and it has been a little while. My team and I have taken a break to retool this podcast in light of some new, hopefully life-giving developments at the magazine, which you'll be hearing about soon enough. But this podcast will continue accompanying our magazine's themes as they trapeze along various nodes of our societal zeitgeist quarter to quarter, but with a more rigorous commitment to featuring those models living today whose response to pain, often 8 miles deep beneath the news cycle, gives us reason to hope, to try, and to engage similarly in our own contexts, despite our weariness, sometimes our dread, and certainly our excuses. Today is the first episode of the spring season, a season that sees Comet treading carefully and soberly through the minefield of violence. Our print issue is asking a question that, for us, is not rhetorical, though we are people of Christian faith. That question is it possible for peace to walk in power anymore? With me today to explore the raw openness of this question in one of its most intimate settings is June Park. June is a chaplain at Tampa General Hospital whose public posts about death, grief, trauma, and loss have garnered a following, and worthily so. I remember the first time I was alerted to June's voice back in 2022 and was immediately struck by a very different tone than what you typically see on the somewhat self-aggrandizing platform that can be Instagram. When you read June's words, which we will link to in the show notes, you encounter someone who is no stranger to the things we all naturally dread as human beings. The dark night of losing a loved one, of having to accept a complete lack of control, of having to face the inescapability of our own mortality. June carries a wisdom earned from the trenches of what he calls grief catching, the act of standing present as someone is falling through the abyss of loss and pain. His words and the vocation of presence that is his daily work have moved me deeply. And I've invited him to the Whole Person Revolution today to share some of what he's learned about the strange paradoxes of dying and human wholeness, violence and healing, doubt and faith. June, welcome to the podcast. It's a real honor to meet you and have you speak to Comet's community. Thanks.
And I'm very happy and grateful, honored to be here. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction too.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. It's been like very rich gift to me to just marinate in what you've put out there beyond what you do. I feel like you're kind of like a Atul Gawande, like you're in the hospital by day and still able to put words together by night.
Gosh.
It's quite a gift to the world. So could you just introduce yourself a bit to our listeners? Just a little vocational autobiography, what your path was to becoming a hospital chaplain?
Sure. So I've been a hospital chaplain now for this year will be 9 years. And before that, I was in like pastoral church ministry. And I guess moving backwards, before that, I went to seminary, but I wasn't quite a Christian at the time. So I grew up an atheist, and I was going to choose between either psychology or seminary and surprise my whole family by choosing seminary. But I thought within church ministry, I can still help, I can still counsel, I can still have a group of people that I can work with and be alongside. But what I recognized pretty quickly was growing up an atheist and then suddenly making this hard turn into church ministry. Church was not exactly what I had hoped or thought that it would be. And I guess the quickest summary that I can make it is I thought entering in that I was going to learn how to love more. But there was something about not all churches, but the American church broadly and largely felt like it was telling me to love less, drawing lines, very, very thick lines in the sand. And so I always felt like I was looking in through a window when I was in church ministry. And then I was in a healthy church at the time after about 6-7 years. But I felt, as they say, called to go. And so I had heard around that time about chaplaincy, and it sounded almost like paradise, you know? Yeah, just this idea of being able to be a pastor outside of the church in some of the most difficult situations we can imagine. I mean, we have military chaplains, prison, even now medical examiner's office. There's workplace chaplains if there's a loss in the workplace, and then the hospital and healthcare settings, hospice. And so when I got in, unlike those 6-7 years of doing church ministry, where I always felt like on the outside, in chaplaincy, I finally felt like I was on the inside and I belonged. As hard and as difficult as it was, I was like, I think all my experience, even the trauma that I grew up with, the training that I received, all of it, there was something about it that I knew all the pieces of my story fit here. And that's where I'm at now. And 9 years, almost 9 years later, I can't imagine being anywhere else. This is exactly where I want to be.
Wow. It's so interesting. I have found over I would say the last decade, that some of my heroes, like living heroes of the faith, but also when I say hero, I mean just people who are really pouring out their lives in a way that I recognize as Christ-like. Many of them have a similar background, and I don't know if it's some specific to history and time, like the last 60 years, but they thought that full love and self-sacrificial pouring out would be able to be channeled through the church, and that the world would be changed because of the kinds of churches we had could change our kind of world. And many of them have left, not leaving their faith entirely, usually probably going through somewhat of a tough reckoning process of identity and calling, but they have found the new church outside of the church. Whether in community rebuilding or in hospitals, and I find that dynamic like very interesting, and maybe it's a little bit my own sometimes bias towards the public sphere and the broader like rambunctious civil society in which we find ourselves, and some frustration with an institution that seems all about words and beliefs and very little of like the pursuit and the actual actions required. When I think sometimes about like the kingdom, it's much broader terrain than how it's usually described in church.
And you know what? I mean, I think when I sometimes talk about hospital chaplaincy, I feel like I'm romanticizing a little bit, you know, because I'll say like, oh, the hospital is exactly how the church should be. And then you get into healthcare and wow, healthcare has a whole other set of stuff going on. But I do sense that, and I'm again generalizing here when I say this, that with the church, one of the issues I found was that there were so many personalities clashing against each other, and there were so many people on different pages, and so many good ideas there was just constant friction about how to make that coalesce and come together. And in the hospital, it feels like, hey, common goal, common mission. We're up against a system that's very difficult and so multi-layered. We don't know where the bureaucracy starts or ends. It's just this behemoth. And at the same time, we know what our goal is. And so I think the church, of course, has its place, and it does some things really, really well. But I don't think I personally fit into it. So I don't want to romanticize too much like, hey, give up your churches, pastors, you should leave and become chaplain, you know, because I'll still once in a while talk with my friends who are pastors, and they're looking at me like, gosh, you're so lucky you get to work in a hospital. I'm like, you know, I feel lucky. And at the same time, there's just as many, there's a different kind of difficult, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I am curious. You talked about when you walked into this new chapter as a hospital chaplain 9 years ago and feeling this deep sense of sort of clicking and belonging. Do you remember your initial reaction, like your first assignment, quote unquote, like your very first day? Even as you may have sensed this is where I belong, were there moments of like, whoa, just shock, given, frankly, what I would consider like just an underworld of hell in human emotion and rawness that we don't often see like out and about in the quote non-hospital world?
Yeah. You know, I do remember very specifically 2 instances. You know, chaplains, we start with a 6-month internship, and then we get a year-long residency. And so those are programs that we have to apply and be approved for. So I was very blessed and lucky and grateful to get into both of them. And I remember that first week, we were asked to walk around by ourselves through the hospital. So here I have this intern badge. Don't go into any rooms, but just go ahead and walk around and take a tour. And I've worked a lot since then, and maybe this was a different kind of day. But that day I happened to walk around was almost like consolidated microcosm of just chaos and injury, because every hallway that I walked, there seemed to be some kind of emergency happening. And I remember there was a woman who had fallen out of her wheelchair in the hallway, and she was just yelling, "I am so tired. I am so tired." I remember that's one of the first things I saw in this hallway. And I think people were running to help her, but she was kind of pushing them away. Like she wanted to do it, but at the same time yelling, "I'm so tired." And it was just this kind of very conflicting, chaotic situation that was unfolding, where she was yelling, "I'm tired," but didn't want help. And at the same time was just on the ground, almost helpless. And so I was kind of doing this: should I intervene? Should I help? Or should I step back? Because it looks like she wants to, maybe I should respect her autonomy. And that was going to be a situation that would occur again many, many times, that dance between, do I press in or pull back? And then I remember my first clinical where I actually shadowed one of the chaplains. And the way those clinicals work is the shadowing almost occurs at first I shadow them, then they shadow me, and then to the point where I'm kind of autonomously moving by myself, independently doing all the clinicals. But I was shadowing that day, and we were in a waiting room at the emergency department. And we accompanied a physician who had to tell a family, your loved one has just died, in the emergency department. And I remember when they told this family, rightly so, there was so much wailing, just an explosion of emotion, just as I would react, just as many of us would. And I remember this chaplain and I, it took both of us, I think, to be there and present for this family, and to be, what we clinically call non-anxious, non-judgmental, comforting presence for them. And I remember thinking in that room, and I think maybe any of us would be lucky to find a place where we feel like, oh, this is where my calling all fits together. But I remember thinking, I'm nervous, I'm scared, I don't want to say the wrong thing. And at the same time, I know that this is where I belong, and I'm going to bring all of myself to be of comfort to this family, bring all of myself without centering myself, so that they may find some peace in the midst of this terrible news they received. And I remember even when I toured the hospital, seeing all the things I did, I was nervous and scared, but I remember feeling like I could do this. I can do this. I was made for this. And so those two specific instances, that tour and that waiting room, really felt like there's something in the body or mind or soul that clicks when everything that I've been through has led me right here.
It's quite an art form to figure out how to dwell in your own insecurity and uncertainty as its own form of being human with one another, even though you are there to serve and to accompany and to be a comfort. That's quite a path to embark upon every day. As I mentioned in the introduction, you have described your role as a, quote, grief catcher, which is such a poetic phrase. And I've wondered a bit. I was like, I wonder if that has been used in indigenous communities in an ancient sense, or other parts of the world. Like something about the phrase I just found very evocative. Do you remember the moment when that identity struck you as this is what I'm doing?
Yeah. I think it comes from two places, where it's Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger.
Oh, got it. I should know that. Sorry, that's my freshman high school reading is too long ago.
Oh, gosh. I mean, I think every young American male. I mean, I was born and raised here. Goes through a phase where Catcher in the Rye becomes like kind of our Bible / tome for life or something.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, when I read it, I was like, oh, so really, it's looking back at it now, it's almost a little bit like, wow, it's a little. How do the kids say? It's a little cringe,
It's a little
maybe
cringe.
a little
Yeah.
bit. You read it, and you're like, wow, that. Well, at least old me appreciated literature, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of thing. Yeah. But, there's a brilliant scene, in fact, that has to do with grief in that book, where, the main character, Holden, he has that dream about being in a field of rye and kids are falling off the edge and he's trying to catch them. And there's something about innocence and mortality and youth. And there is something about the unfolding of time. And Holden is trying to hold it all together. It's no surprise. His name is Holden Caulfield. He's just trying to hold it all together on this field where he's desperately trying to catch kids, really, children that are falling off this edge. And that to me, as maybe the rest of the book has, been criticized, analyzed, and scrutinized in different ways now. But that scene to me still is a brilliant, beautiful, almost desperate metaphor of how we feel when we see someone hurting and in pain. And, also the phrase dream catcher is, and I could be saying this incorrectly, but I think dream catcher is something about the protection over someone that nightmares would elude them. So that they would have good dreams only. That I think that's what that a dream catcher is. I could be wrong about that. And yeah, but in short, I'm pretty sure that's what it is. But when I think in terms of grief catcher, I think in terms of several levels, at least two. One is some people are literally falling to the floor in their grief. I mean, they're literally physically falling over, crumpling into a heap. And what can I do physically, emotionally, spiritually to catch them on the way down? Not to stop their grief, but to be with them. So if they're on the floor, I am on the floor. I am congruent with their experience and what they're going through. If they're worried, concerned, hurt, anxious, screaming, I don't tell them, don't worry. I remember one time telling my 3.5-year-old daughter, hey, it just came out of my mouth, hey, don't worry about it. And my daughter's pretty tough. She looked at me and she said, Dad, no, I am worried about it. It gave me a good lesson. We learn from our children, right?
Yes.
I thought, you know what? You have a right to be worried about it.
Yeah.
And and then the other thing too is I always hear at deathbeds, at bedsides of those who are ill or injured, families around, I always hear stories in grief of who this person is and was and what they meant to this family. I'm always catching stories. And in some sense, I catch grief vicariously, but it's in the telling of the story and the solidifying of this person's narrative and what they meant and their meaning in life and they're almost etching themselves out of marble, and I get to see the life of this person, sometimes just in minutes, sometimes in sentences. And in that sense, I am catching that grief. And when we grieve, I think we make meaning out of a person's life. And what an honor and what a sacred access that I get to be able to be at bedside, to catch these stories of the departed. And so there's some sense where I'm catching people as they fall, and I'm also catching these stories. And I remember all of them. I honor them. I dream about them. And so in that sense, I'm a grief catcher. And I think it would be wise and compassionate for each of us to consider, when you have a friend who's grieving, how can I catch them, not to stop them, but to be with them, and also catch that story, that they would have that space to be able to share the meaning of why they are grieving.
For some reason, it's sort of maybe almost perversely the other side of life, but it's like a form of midwifery. It feels like the way you're describing it. It's like a midwife in the opposite direction, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm in the world of words by profession. And it does seem like the word healing in particular, while there is on the one hand such aching need for it across all of our various divisions, and we are very fluent in the language of trauma now, I would say, at least as a generation. I don't think healing itself is like a demonized word, but it does seem to have become more complicated in our time, perhaps because of our sensitivity to savior complexes and power dynamics, et cetera. And I'm just curious how you react just to the word. Do you use it? Do you think that this is a piece of what you are doing? Yeah. Do you think it is a complicated word legitimately? And how do you sort of understand what healing is at its best and truest?
Yeah, healing, you're right. It is a really big word that may have become a little bit mainstream, commodified, commercialized, like a lot of words like authenticity or vulnerability. And sometimes when I hear healing, the cynical part of me thinks, wow, it's a sort of a generic catch-all term and maybe not even always the goal. Um, but I think healing in terms of, because to be transparent, I think in my book promotional materials, there's something like find healing in your grief or something like that.
Hashtag.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm pretty sure, I think I did a control F through my Word document. I'm like, there's certain words I was like, am I using wholeness too much?
Right.
Using
Oh
healing too much?
boy, do I hear you
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah. I'm like, I better replace that with something,
Yeah.
yeah, use a visual description, don't just use the broad word,
Yes.
I guess.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
good.
So sometimes I'll do that, but healing is, I think, if I'm to look at through the optimistic lens, the optimistic part of me, which is I think my default state, it is something we desire. There's a safety and dignity that we all want. Safety in our own bodies, a dignity of our own value, and I think with healing, what makes me nervous about it is that with my patients, they may never find the quote unquote healing that they really hope for. Physical healing, it may just not come. I'll hear stories of people where somebody used the phrase with me the other day, I'm just chasing this cancer. They couldn't get ahead of it. And they had they had so many treatments and they had the resources to do it, to I guess, be in remission. But every single time they couldn't get ahead of it. And I think what is healing for this person? Is healing really, is the end goal to be in complete remission? Or as one of my fellow chaplains, Amy, she says, maybe we can find what it looks like to relocate our hope. Where can we put our definition of healing instead? And so that sometimes sounds like a consolation, but at the same time, when we use the word healing, I think they're going to have to be adjustable, adaptable, different versions of healing for everyone. Sometimes healing really means, my dad, I don't want them to be on life support for 2 months. It's just too much on their body. Maybe they feel it, maybe they don't, but maybe they can go in peace. And that's what healing has to be for them. Maybe it is going to be, this person really, really is okay with suffering through the hardest of chemo treatments and experimental things, and their, willingness and their kind of courage to go through all of that, that's going to be healing for them, regardless of the outcome. It's just tough. So when I think of healing, I take it case by case. I look at person by person, and where is your hope located? And if we get to a certain phase in the illness or injury, can we relocate our hope and adjust to that and what it looks like?
There's a lot of wisdom right there in what you're saying. And I wonder, just hearing you, I think sometimes, and perhaps what we are even subconsciously reacting against these days when we hear loose talk of healing, whether about a whole society or in the most intimate areas of our physical bodies and or a relationship, is it's like so it can feel so ends oriented. And I think so much of what I see in your own witnessing to what has been revealed to you in your day-to-day work and accompaniment of people is the process of allowing someone else to feel fully heard and seen, which is, yeah, you've just answered this so much better. Of course, there are beautiful miracles and healing can be possible in that end-oriented state, remission. But I like how you're describing it. Like there is something in our interconnective process with one another that is more of what it's all about than achieving an end.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally right. I'm with you. I'm tracking with you 100%. I mean, this may or may not have to do with healing, but when I see requests made by patients and their families, sometimes I feel like the room in a hospital, especially for patients with incredibly long length of stay, their physical healing may never come. And so how can we make a room that in some sense will bring healing to that patient and to their family? And so we'll get, requests like, is it okay if we bring in pictures? Is it okay if we bring in flowers? Is it okay if we bring in this blanket from home? And the answer is always yes. I'll even get requests like on somebody's living will, which is the express desire of what you would like if you ever end up on life support. There's options to remove certain modes of care, certain things of care, measures of care. And then here it says additional instructions. And I've seen things like, never let my lips go dry. Always put chapstick on them. If I'm on a ventilator, I don't want to die with dry lips. I've seen, which sounds silly, but that's for them. That's what they want. And, that's what would make them most comfortable, feel safe and dignified. There's another one where they said, let my dogs and cats say goodbye to me. Can you bring them to the hospital? And they know that they may not make it out of that hospital room, but for them to have their dogs and cats say goodbye to them, that's going to be healing for them. And so I've really had to shift and adjust. I think there is something in religiosity and spirituality that you were saying that word about. It's measured in ends, like outcomes. Sometimes there is some sense in which we think, oh, it's all going to be okay. And the okay goal looks like completely free of disease and injury and illness, being able to go back to complete regular living. And there's maybe something ableist about that. There's maybe something very restrictive and harmful and hurtful to someone's outlook. Because if you say the goal is here and you don't get it, then what does that say about you as a person, right? Yeah, but I think readjusting, relocating, those conversations are not easy. They're very difficult, but so important to have about if this can't happen, then what would help you to feel most safe and dignified here?
Right. June, listening to you, I'm wondering, do you have a opening to your day ritual as you walk into that hospital that so you can kind of, even as you talk about like holding every memory and you remember everything that has been said, every story, you have dreams about it. So all of this is like in you from the days and months and years before. But as you start a new day, as a human being, entering into these various rooms, not knowing what you're going to encounter, whether it's a prayer, whatever it is that allows you to be fully present and agile as someone just, asks for chapstick or to bring their pet, all the chaos you may encounter. How do you prepare yourself?
And what a good question. Like when you asked that, I was smiling and laughing a little bit because when I get to the office, the first people I see are other chaplains.
Right.
And, we have a particular connectedness / banter / camaraderie.
Yeah, and probably a unique form of humor, I'm guessing.
Yeah. Behind closed doors in a hospital, like it's nothing we would ever want to say in front of patients and families. And I promise it never gets too crude.
No.
Yeah.
Sure
And
not.
I'm actually one of those who I struggle with healthcare memes. Like I don't really follow any of those pages. I know some health coworkers do. And that's, if they love that, that's great. I think for me, it's like, but when I get into the room and I talk with chaplains, there is a particular kind of humor and banter and rapport that we have that always seems to set me at ease and make me, I always know I'm not doing this work alone. Like being in that office, there's something about going to a patient's room. And then what another chaplain told me is following the golden thread back to refuge. like our office area is this sacred area where we huddle together. And I don't mean to, I guess, make this too much of a comparison, but when I think of war zones, I guess, or when I think of first response type situations, there's something about this refuge, this home base, this area where we can get back together and replenish and kind of, refill our supplies and things like that. And so with chaplains, I enter in and I always process with them and kind of see how the day is going. And they sometimes, maybe we're so close because we're trauma bonding, it could be that. But we sort of process with each other how the day is going to go and what it's going to look like. And is it that kind of day or we don't use a cue word, oh, it's been quiet. As soon as you say that in the hospital, that kind of thing. But yeah, that. And then to your other point about, is there a personal thing that I do? Before I enter every single room, I always sanitize. And I always ask, I say this prayer to myself, say, God, how do you want to work through me? That's always the prayer that I have. And the reason I have that kind of open-handed prayer is it keeps me open to being with this patient without agenda or assumption, without my own stuff, without putting my own stuff on them, bringing maybe my skill or capacity or any humanity or compassion that I can bring into the room, but also being open to, in a sense, this patient is going to lead with their story and their pain. And for me not to try to fix it, but to allow a big space and a sacredness for God to be over that room. And so that's the prayer that I always pray. I don't, sometimes you ever do that thing, Anne, where like, let's say you're writing an article or a book and you just read a book and you start writing what you just read into the article a little bit. I sometimes get in my own head where it's like a citation, then you start writing about that citation. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Yeah. So I don't want to go into the room like that,
Right. It's like piling up baggage. Yeah, of course. I completely know. I think we all know that experience.
Yeah. You just walk in and yeah, when you're writing the thing, you start taking on the voice of the thing you just read, or it's almost like you're conversing with that author or piece. But there's a part of you where it's like, no, I'm bringing myself and I'm also open-handed with this. And so, God, whatever you want to do through me. And I know that prayer has been used not in helpful ways, but for me, it's almost like I'm going to keep open hands as compassionately as I can.
Yes. And like a real posture of trust and attentiveness. I feel like it would open up my own attentiveness to be co-laboring with God as humbly as possible. But so many of your writings, and I should say to listeners, this would be a side postscript I would love to just explore more in another conversation, but I noticed on your blog you say you have a hashtag for typewriter therapy. So I should tell listeners at least your Instagram posts, many of them, not all of them, but have been, are like a little typewritten a photograph of a typewritten, I would call it kind of like a little proverb. And at some point, I would imagine actually typing on a typewriter is very cathartic.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And I'm sure not alone in discovering that. But the posts themselves, so many of them, they're like little poems, or I mean, sometimes it's prose, but they come to me at least visually in kind of verse, and they feel like, I think part of why so many people have discovered you and sort of followed your writing about your day-to-day role is that while you're writing out of the grounded concreteness of very real human beings suffering and dying, and you're writing out of that, something about them applies to a much broader pathos in our time. I would say, especially probably in the West. I mean, I'm sure in other parts of the world, but it feels especially like some pathologies in the West are a late modern moment where we're just like fighting to stay fully human. And I'm wondering, it feels like there's a paradox in some of what you're observing, in that when someone is dying or when loved ones are surrounding someone who's like not emerging out of surgery, quote, successfully, it seems like you're invoking stories where people are liberated at the very end of their lives to not live behind a mask anymore. So I'm just curious, as you've noticed this over and again, like what is going on that we tend to find, many of us tend to find, not always, but tend to find life's final moments weirdly liberating?
Yeah, I think each of us do have a universal and specific desire to be seen and to know that I mattered and my life mattered, and that I left something, I did something, I made something, I was here. And it's universal in that I think all of us feel it and desire it in some sense. And I think it's specific in that we each specifically have some sort of thumbprint or footprint unique to each of us individually. And so I remember reading or hearing a podcast, maybe it was through NPR or something, where there is this retirement village that is mostly populated by an Indian American population. And it was a retirement home with just Indian American, and they accept anyone, but it just became filled with Indian Americans. And the theory of why that happened was because as you get closer to the end, I think the joke was, do you get more racist as you get closer to the end? Which is that, yeah, that would be maybe for some folks, but because it's like they only just wanted to be with each other. They didn't want diversity or anything like that. But what I loved about that podcast is I think the theory is that as you get more to the end, you just want to be seen. And you are seen by those who are familiar to you, those who may even understand you in shorthand. I have had an Asian American therapist who there was just an understanding there. And so kind of taking that idea, being at the end, we do just want to be seen by our family. But I've sat also with patients who had no one, and they would rather have had someone than no one. And I'm sometimes the last witness. And they will tell me about their life and all the ways they had to hide in order to survive. And they will tell me who they really wanted to be or who they were, or the missed opportunities, or the turns they didn't take, or the doors they didn't open. And, a lot of that, and this could be a whole other conversation, is that systemic resources and the way that our world is set up, our world machine, the way that it grinds so many of us, we can't get the things that we want because there are so many obstacles and barriers. And at the same time, even those I've talked with who had the choice, they chose another way out of conformity or out of wanting to assimilate to those around them, out of fear. And so even those who had the option to choose decided, I'm going to live everyone else's vision for my life because in this way I can be comfortable. But in being comfortable, maybe they sacrifice their own safety and dignity. And so at the end, yeah, I at the end, I've just heard so many stories about this is who I am. And what they're really asking me is, do you see me? Do you see me? And of course, my answer is always yes, to the fullest capacity that I can. Even if I've only known you for this minute, I see you.
Right. Yeah. You walk profound waters, June. This is deep stuff, but with a smile. Thank you for that. Speaking of systems of all kinds, there is a treasured kind of body of philosophy, which ironically has an ism at the end of it that I have sort of been shaped by, and it's called personalism. And it's tended to actually be championed, certainly in the 20th century, more by female philosophers, which I don't think is totally an accident. But if I could sum it up, it's this idea that, yes, there may be, we may believe there are such things as natural law and abstract systems of thought, but that you can never replace the infinite complexity and beauty of a person and history, like travels through persons and relationships. So I tend to be biased more in that direction when I think about big questions like how do societies change and kind of theories of history And even like I live in DC, which is a very systems oriented place, as you might imagine, on all sorts of levels. And it can be easy for me with my bias towards trying to maintain a personalism through kind of walls of dogma and top-down assumptions and generalizations about people groups, et cetera, to see systems as the enemy. And I see you as like walking inside in a hospital, which is embedded within a much broader set of healthcare norms in a society and a culture, that nonetheless has a place for you as a chaplain to be deeply, infinitely, uniquely personal with every single person and family that you encounter. And I'm just would love to constructively ask, over time, how do you see like the possibility for a system, say in this case, a healthcare system, to nurture the conditions for more of the kind of personalism I think we all need, not just at the end of our lives, but all along the way as we walk through these behemoths. There are certain things at scale are very helpful. Obviously, modern medicine has thrived off of like big scale. But yeah, how do you think about the constructive relationship of systems that somehow figure out a way to be the backdrop support for the most vital, transformative healing, if I can use that word, like personalist moments?
Yeah. I would say, Anne, it does depend on the day that you ask me.
I was going to say,
because there are some days where I know the system, as obdurate as and as obstinate as it can be, sometimes compassion and humanity slips through the cracks, and we're able to get something done, or even because of and through the system, we can get it done. And then there are other days where the system is so frustrating, infuriating, devastating to families. I am one of those folks, I guess, that I am doing my best to work within the system that we have. And, my default state being optimism, I try to find a way in the system to get it done if I can. And, if there's a patient who is suffering deeply, and then on top of that, they're experiencing these extraneous or tertiary griefs, which are their insurance is not going to pay for them. They lost their job because they've been in the hospital too long. Opportunity costs because of their health. They can no longer get the opportunities they used to in a much more ableist society. Those kinds of things, I try to find ways in which to navigate the system where, okay, how do we get with the social worker and case management to find resources to help this person through all those losses that they're experiencing? Because every loss is wrapped around multiple losses. And it's so difficult sometimes to get through that system. But I am trying to, the best I can, remain optimistic in it. Probably, Anne, you caught me on a good day because I'm a little more hopeful about the systems that we're in right now. I was watching this interview the other day with John Oliver, and he said sometimes when he and his team do research for a piece that they're writing, they get to a point where they look at each other and they'll say, we need to just burn it all down. We got to burn this down and start over. There's no way we can live like this in this hell that we created. And then he says he gets into this other place eventually where he'll look at the incremental steps made in progress and say, this is valuable too. And so, when I visit a patient who is a victim of violent abuse and none of their systems or institutions are helping them, or even won't believe their story, I try to find a way, how can I advocate for this person in this iron web of disbelief and this smog of siding with the abuser? This unfortunate, terrible system that is set against the victim. The victim is living in deficit. They're already abused, and then they're now running against a system that will not believe them or aid them. So how can I, as a chaplain, walk them through that? Is there anything I can even do? And so can I get them one step closer to reparation, restitution? Is it just enough for me to believe that person And for that day, that person feels like at least one person saw me. So I'm finding all these ways that I can try to advocate in a system that is so difficult. Like I was saying earlier, it's hard to know where the bureaucracy starts or ends. It's like an untraceable villain, you know? And I don't mean to villainize it, because there are parts of the system we need. And the system itself, you know, is something that we as a large society need. And so I think all as healthcare workers, we wish we could spend more time with our patients. That's the thing I hear often, more time. But we're stretched, or we're understaffed, or we just don't have the resources to do it. Or sometimes I heard up in New York or something, or maybe in DC, the nurse to patient ratios are like 20-1, which is just awful. It's just awful. I mean, you can even just imagine a server trying to serve 20 tables. That's impossible. So how do we work within that system? How do we get the resources? And so I'm saying a lot, Anne, and this is something I've thought about a lot. And I'm saying a lot of different things in a kind of disparate way. But I am very much trying to optimistically move through the system and move within the capacity that I have, because I know that each step that I take may move the needle just a tiny little bit. You know what I mean? I don't know if it's going to dismantle or disrupt the system entirely. Just move that needle a tiny little bit. But if we can move that needle a tiny little bit in our generation, then those after us might be able to move it just a little bit more. And we remain ever vigilant in doing that. And so I hope I'm a part of that little needle shift towards better.
Well, from where I sit, you are. It's a long marathon of hope, not without discernment and not without moments to stop and stand athwart it. And just going back to something you said about, because we haven't talked so much about abuse, which is a word that almost automatically comes to mind a lot these days when we hear the word system. Abuses of power, the ways in which bureaucracies can perpetuate great evil. This is a longstanding historical reality. You've had some very interesting posts that have convicted me, actually, about a little bit more specific to our tendency as human beings to excuse abuse and abusers, whether they are particular people or broader, more nebulous forces within norms and a system. Why do we do this? Like, I think most of us don't want to excuse dominating power or just like accept the status quo when we're in our best modes of like conscience and on our own and thinking of the kinds of human beings we'd like to be. But then environments and preceding conditions are really powerful. You had one line I just really caught me. It was, you said, any hostile environment just feels like home growing up. I know this is a huge psychological question. I'm not asking you to be the world's expert on it, but just some humble reflection on our own frailty before inheritances in a system that were designed well before our own agency, and why we're not always on the right side in a given moment of watching someone be really vulnerable and not dignified or believed.
Yeah. First, I want to say thank you for this question, because it does need to be talked about more. Because in some sense, all of us share culpability in this, but and I include myself in that. But yeah, I've written at length before, so I apologize. I may be repeating things I've said, like I feel like so much already, but I do think a lot of it is, power in the end wants to exploit for its own gain. And so it must maintain status quo and has to dehumanize in order to gain what it wants. And so to aid or help someone, to be with someone, to be present for them, to give over resources to them, that requires something of us: love, sacrifice, being gracious. And so power by its own state is easy mode. It's easier in some way. It's easier to believe the abuser because you don't have to do anything. To be a bystander, you can just stay and be a spectator. But to actually be involved with the victim requires much of us.
Costly, yeah.
It's very costly. And so I think the way that systems have become set up is to benefit the abuser, because psychologically, socially, emotionally, even financially, it's almost an easy mode. And quite a few of us will take the path of least resistance, not wanting to get involved. And it's hard to get involved. To be fair, it's very difficult. So I find that as one of the biggest obstacles for us to be able to tackle this entire problem of not believing the victim and not helping them in their abuse and in their injury. But I've also seen other things that have come out of maybe a deeper well of trying to understand. Like sometimes the abuse that I see is so horrific that it's almost like by human instinct we turn away because we can't believe such evil exists.
Yeah.
It's just hard to think that any human is capable of rendering such evil against another person made in God's image. It's just unthinkable to even think that. Also, I think sometimes when we see a victim, we may think, oh, what happened to them is not that bad, because by saying it is that bad, we may be incriminating ourselves because of something that we have done, or so we have to change kind of the baseline or the standard a little bit. We move the goalpost a little bit because we don't want to look at ourselves. So we say, wow, if that's abuse, then maybe I've also incurred that same injury against someone else. And yeah, there's all these kind of psychological difficult barriers in play that I understand make it very difficult to call evil and to call abuse what it is. What does it say about me if I call that abuse? And so all these little things come together to where I've noticed HR, law enforcement, the institutions, education, healthcare, even when people want to believe you and say, I hear your story of abuse, I see your bruises, I do believe you. At that point, it is so difficult to build a case to get restitution and reparation. It's almost impossible. And there are people doing incredible work to get there. I'm thinking of Amanda Nguyen, who, if you follow her on Instagram, she does amazing work advocacy for victims of abuse. And at the same time, there is going to be something in our default status quo that's just going to find it easier to turn away.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do we turn to? How do we turn to? That's the question.
This is like kind of a whole other episode in itself. Thank you for that. And thank you for writing about this. You gave that sort of beautiful narrative of what a grief catcher is. And I do love that image to describe what you find yourself doing day to day. But I also have come to understand you a bit as this like bridge, or you're like a bridge making visible and clear that somehow mysteriously, but also very physically and scientifically too, we are existentially connected to one another. And I just was trying to put myself in your shoes with some fear and trembling as I've been meditating in your writing. I would just guess that like the reality of that interconnectedness physically, spiritually, emotionally, just memories and formation, all like how all that swirls together in ways we probably never be able to measure, fully understand, that interconnectedness just becomes more profound to you, both in your own body and experience walking alongside people, but also as you witness it with specifically those, I would say, dying and those left behind. Could you reflect a bit on what being a chaplain has taught you about our connection to one another?
Yeah. As you were asking that question, I thought, gosh, this is going to be a downer, I guess.
Oh.
So, yeah, because I mean, this is going to be as real as I can get, is that when I'm with a patient, sometimes, no, not even sometimes, when I'm with my patient, there is a temptation for me to think, here's this person over here experiencing this pain, and I am the provider. And what I have to remember about our interconnectedness is that I'm probably only 1 or 2 steps removed from their situation. And that's true for many of us. What makes me a provider? What makes me over this person or over this person's bed? And the situations and systems that we're in, I worked for 3 years at a nonprofit for the unhoused. And so many times when I heard their stories, I was like, that easily could happen to any of us. You know, when they tell the story about they were a business owner and they were thriving, and then all of a sudden 2008 economic recession or 2020 pandemic, I lost everything, and now they're living out of their cars. That could happen to any of us. Many of us are, maybe except for the 0.1% or, the 1%, but we are quite, close to that situation. And so I'm reminded that they feel pain like anyone else. They're not much more stronger or durable than us. Sometimes we think, oh, you're so strong, or, oh, you got so much of this and that. And I'm just, no, they feel just as much pain as anyone else. And they're unhoused patients that I'll see. I think that there is a large social bias against patients who are elderly, or, oh, maybe they don't have a lot of life ahead of them, or, oh, if they're unhoused, we don't need to treat them as much. In the hospital I work at, I'm at a safety net hospital. We receive people regardless of income or insurance. And so I've seen the level of care that's offered, and it's incredible. I mean, it's phenomenal. But I know just from the larger healthcare system at large, I know that there is a bias. It's going to be an implicit bias, even if we're not aware of it. And we may think, oh, this unhoused patient, they live under a bridge, they've been living a hard life, they can just take it, they're fine. Let me be rough with this IV, or let me be, they don't need painkillers, they can just take it. But I'll have unhoused patients tell me, I feel what you feel, I can't just take it. This is just as hard on me as it would be for you. And so part of that interconnectedness is me recognizing their pain is real. Their pain is just as deep as mine. And they don't have some kind of special endurance that's going to help. I mean, I absolutely applaud them for getting through what they have gotten through, but it's not because of some special endurance, really. It's because they had to get through it. And here they are. And so, that saying, whatever doesn't kill you
makes you stronger.
Yeah, right. Gosh, I mean, there are just times like, I just think, well, whatever doesn't kill you will eventually. It's, or whatever doesn't kill you will leave you seriously injured for the rest of your life, Yeah. And so I think that's a bit of a downer point, but I guess I say that to say, when you see someone experiencing that depth of pain, I've just felt this much deeper empathy and compassion to where that person doesn't feel pain any differently than me. So how can I, as if they were my family? How can I, as if they were me? How can I, as if they were, as Jesus had said in Matthew 25, whatever you did for the least of these, you've done for me. How can I then go out of my way for this person who is not just my patient, but a person made in the image of God, just like me, just like all of us? And so that has taught me that they are not separate from me, that we are one body, that we are made of this one image. And that compels me as much as I can. Every complaint, every story, every concern, I treat it as seriously as I can, and I treat them with all the reverence they deserve.
It's beautiful, June. Thank you. I have so appreciated the honesty with which you inhabit the Christian faith in public, and just the care with which you do that. And I just think that must be kind of a mirror of how you inhabit this rather strange faith in the hospital itself. And this is a question that I fear you might reject, because you're going to say, I'm not trying to make you out to be more saintly than you are or anything, but again, trying to put myself in your shoes and really thinking about the physicality of falling down with someone to the floor as they're wailing, or probably wiping the brow of someone dying and just really trying to make them feel heard. And you just said, looking at them as, what Jesus said, as you so treated them, so you are treating me.
Mm-hmm.
There is that. There's the Christ in the other person in the moment of profound weakness and pain. But there's also like what it is to sort of be someone who is able to stay open to keep weeping and suffering with, which is a very like co-laboring with Jesus kind of a thing. And I'm just wondering what you have learned about Christ himself, the man, as you have gone about this role over the last 9 years, and like this is a very intimate question, but sort of when in the moments when you have felt his presence with you, what that has taught you about this faith in the context of deep suffering.
Yeah. What a powerful question. I got to say first, and I don't always get it right. Sometimes I get a little ahead of my patient. Sometimes I don't connect completely. I'd like to think that I'm a pretty decent chaplain some days, but there are also times, you use the word saintly, and I was like, oh, I know there are times that I've, or you said you don't want to paint me as too saintly, so I guess I'm in a.
Well, maybe you are, but I didn't want to.
I wanted to make sure I keep myself in check, and that I know that I don't get it right every time. But one thing, I guess, when I think about the ministry of Christ, I think, there are so many things we could say about how Christ walked with people and how he loved people. And I guess those to me are like these broad, big picture things that we all got to keep in mind, But one thing I think I want to point to is, on the cross when Jesus, maybe it was in John, said to John, behold your mother, and, pointed to his own mother. And then Jesus said to Mary, his mother, said, behold your son, and pointed to John. There's something beautiful and heartbreaking, devastating, something complete, and to circle back, healing about that single command that Jesus gave from the cross. That was just like his one command to both Mary and to John, and that you're going to need each other to get through this. And you're both maybe not related, but you've walked together for 3 years, and you're maybe not next of kin, but you are next to kin, and you're next for kin. So there's something about that I can't even quite articulate, but that I have found where when I'm in a room, I just think there is this familial bond of almost Christ telling me, behold, this is your family, this patient, and that's kind of the way in which I try to walk. A lot of times I visit patients who don't have visitors, or their family's busy, and in this world machine, we can't always be at the bedside of our loved one. And so as a chaplain, I'm a presence, and we want flesh and bone presence. We don't want to be alone. And so I often think of Christ in that command, behold, this is your family. This is your brother. This is your sister. And so I think just that it's seemingly simple command is something that I walk with in every patient room. And I really look at that passage differently and how it moves me to walk in the way that Christ has moved me.
I can't imagine a better way to end. It's quite an ellipses and poignant note. Listeners, if you've been moved by this conversation, thank you for listening. And I do encourage you to pre-order June's upcoming book, which will probably ring of some similar notes and fragrances this conversation has. It's titled As Long as You Need Permission to Grieve, and it comes out April 16th. June, what an honor to meet you, and a gift in every way to have you spend this hour plus with me, and just every blessing on your ongoing work and day by day, and that you can sort of keep walking and weeping and offering people hope and a hand. Just thank you for your witness. It's a real inspiration.
And thank you. You work in a world of words. You are really good at this, and you asked amazing questions. I loved our conversation, and I'm open again anytime to chat. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comet Magazine. We exist to foster imagination for a thriving society, and our product line is blossoming. We publish a beautiful print magazine 4 times a year that tries to peer into timely societal questions lurking just behind our everyday consciousness. We publish an additional slew of online essays and personality-flavored columns like Matthew Milliner's Material Mysticism, Greg Thompson's The Welcome Table, and Alan Jacobs' Snakes and Ladders. And we are building an exciting new podcast network with the Whole Person Revolution, joined by Zealots at the Gate, a conversation about religion and democracy with Shadi Hamid and Matthew Koenig. All of this is animated by a rich Christian humanist tradition that we feel well poised to pick up and apply to our times. Please consider participating in this 2,000-year-old conversation and the community rallying around it now. You can write, you can read, you can host a comment supper in your neighborhood or attend one of our webinars with an author and your fellow readers. We want to equip you to be an agent of renewal in our time, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at podcasts@comment.org and expect a substantive exchange. We are honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comment, edited by Becca Bruder, produced and with original music by Allie Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder, and I'll see you in a month.